In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than death. For a Space Marine of the White Scars chapter, few scenarios embody this truth more completely than the capture of one of their exceedingly rare dreadnoughts by the greenskin menace known as Orks. To understand the full horror of this situation, we must first comprehend what it means for a White Scar to be entombed within a dreadnought sarcophagus, and then imagine the desecration that follows when such a sacred war machine falls into the crude, violent hands of the galaxy's most destructive tinkerers. The White Scars are the sons of Jagatai Khan, the great Khan of Chogoris, and they are defined by one thing above all others: speed. They are the lightning strike made manifest, the thundering hooves of the steppes translated into the roar of bike engines and the scream of land speeders across alien skies. For them, warfare is not merely about victory, but about the joy of movement itself, the wind against their faces, even through their helmets, the rush of adrenaline as they hurtle toward the enemy at speeds that would terrify warriors of other chapters. They are nomads at heart, children of the endless plains, and to them, freedom of movement is not just a tactical preference, but a fundamental aspect of their identity. This makes the Dreadnought particularly horrifying to the White Scars. While other chapters view entombment in a Dreadnought as the highest honor, a chance to continue serving the Emperor even after mortal wounds would have claimed their lives, the White Scars see it differently. To them, a Dreadnought is a prison. It is the ultimate denial of everything they hold sacred. The warrior entombed within can no longer feel the rush of speed, can no longer sense the subtle shifts of a bike beneath them, or the G-forces of a hard turn. They are locked in cold metal, moving with the ponderous gait of a walking tank, rather than the fluid grace of a mounted warrior. For a culture that values the fierce joys of physical existence and the simple pleasures of movement, this is a living death more terrible than any battlefield demise. The White Scars chapter maintains very few dreadnoughts compared to other first founding chapters. In fact, many outsiders have claimed that the White Scars don't use dreadnoughts at all, though this is not strictly true. They do exist, but they are rare, rarely seen in battle, and hold a strange, contradictory position within the chapter's hierarchy. Those who are interred are neither honored nor dishonored. Their fate is seen as something in between, a necessary tragedy rather than a glorious transformation. These walking tombs are known in the Chogorian tongue as the Uhan Solban, which translates to Guardians of the Morning and Evening Stars. It's a poetic title, typical of the White Scars' tendency toward beautiful language, even when describing something they find deeply disturbing. The few White Scars who do end up in dreadnoughts often undergo a ceremony called the Tsevel, or rebranding. This ritual allows them to discard their old name and take up a new one, representing their rebirth as a towering war machine. These warriors choose their names from the great arch of the Bartabish, a monument to the undying heroes of the chapter. It is a recognition that the person they were has died, and what remains is something different, something forever changed by the cold embrace of adamantium and ceramite. During the Great Crusade, when the White Scars were still a legion, they organized their dreadnoughts into a specific order, one of several specialized formations within the legion's structure. The Uhan Solban served primarily as guardians, watching over the gene seed vaults on Chogoris and Terra when they were not deployed to battle. They also occasionally supported the Karash, temporary assemblies of volunteers used for diversionary or shock attack roles. The Karash itself was one of the few White Scars orders that made regular use of dreadnoughts, as the slow-moving war machines were unsuited to the rapid strike warfare that defined the Legion's tactical doctrine. So when we consider what happens when Orks capture a White Scars dreadnought, we're dealing with an already tragic figure, a warrior who has sacrificed the very essence of what made them a White Scar to continue serving the Emperor. And then, on top of that existing tragedy, we add the brutal, chaotic desecration that comes when greenskins get their hands on sacred Imperial technology. The Orks are one of the most numerous and widespread threats in the galaxy, a race of brutal, warlike creatures who exist solely for the joy of combat. They are biologically engineered warriors, created by a long-vanished species called the Old Ones, designed to be the perfect soldiers for an ancient war. But their creators are long gone, and the Orks have spread across the galaxy like a green tide, fighting everything they encounter, simply because fighting is what they were made to do and what they love to do. What makes Orks particularly dangerous, beyond their physical toughness and their sheer numbers, is their peculiar relationship with technology. Ork technology should not work. By all the laws of physics and engineering, the ramshackle contraptions they bolt together from scrap metal and salvaged parts should fall apart or explode or simply refuse to function. But they work anyway, and the reason is the Wa. The Wa is a gestalt psychic field generated by all Orks unconsciously. The more Orks gather together, the stronger this field becomes, and it has a reality-warping effect on the world around them. When enough Orks believe something should work, the Wa field makes it work. It's not magic in the traditional sense, and it's not quite the same as the psychic powers wielded by human psykers or Eldar seers. It's something unique to the Orks, a collective belief that imposes itself on reality through the medium of the Imperium. This is why Ork weapons painted red go faster, even though paint color has no bearing on mechanical performance. It's why Ork guns that are little more than pipes welded to triggers can fire devastating volleys. It's why their spacecraft, which look like flying scrap heaps, can travel through the warp and engage Imperial Navy vessels. The Orks believe these things will work, and so they do. The effect is subtle. It doesn't allow Orks to violate the laws of physics entirely, but it gives them just enough of a push to make their crude technology surprisingly effective. Among the Orks, those with a natural affinity for building and tinkering are called mech boys. These are odd boys, a special caste of Orks who are genetically predisposed to excel at specific tasks. Just as pain boys instinctively understand medicine and surgery, mech boys have an innate grasp of mechanical principles that they call Orky know-whats. They don't really learn engineering, they just know it, encoded in their very genetics by the Old Ones who created their species millions of years ago. This knowledge is expressed in the Orks' trademark crude and ramshackle style, but it's nonetheless effective. The most skilled mech boys are known as big mechs, who lead groups of lesser mech boys and sometimes entire warbands. A big mech's mastery of technology is unsurpassed among the greenskin races, and they often generate force fields around themselves to protect their valuable creations. In rare cases, a big mech might become powerful enough to lead an entire Wa, earning the title of mech boss. These are the exceptions rather than the rule, as most Orks prefer their leaders to be good at hitting things rather than building things, but they do exist. Orks are natural looters. They are always on the lookout for bigger and better trophies, and captured enemy equipment is especially prized. When Orks defeat an enemy force and claim the battlefield, teams of looters, often led by spanners, apprentice mechs, scour the wreckage for anything valuable. Wrecked vehicles are hauled back to mech workshops, where mech boys pay handsomely in teeth, the Ork currency, for recovered hulks. The mech boys then set to work customizing these captured vehicles, a process that involves stripping out what the mechs consider unnecessary components, which is usually most of the original vehicle's internal workings, and replacing them with Orky equipment. The result is called a looted wagon, a catch-all term for any enemy vehicle that has been rebuilt to Ork specifications. These vehicles come in all shapes and sizes. Smaller transports like chimeras and rhinos become carts, fast transport vehicles for getting boys to the front line. Heavier vehicles like Lehman Russ battle tanks become wagons, sacrificing transport capacity for bigger guns and thicker armor. The largest captured vehicles, like Baneblades, become battle fortresses, mobile strongholds bristling with weapons. The mech boys often install what they call a big red button in the cockpits of these looted vehicles. What this button does is anybody's guess. Even the mech who installed it probably isn't entirely sure, and pressing it can have wildly different effects. Sometimes it supercharges the engine or the weapons. Sometimes it deploys additional armor plating. Sometimes it causes the vehicle to explode spectacularly. The Orks find this unpredictability hilarious and consider it a feature rather than a bug. Now imagine all of this Ork enthusiasm, all of this crude mechanical ingenuity, all of this love of looting and modifying and making things more Orky, focused on a Space Marine Dreadnought. And not just any Dreadnought, but one of the precious few belonging to the White Scars. A chapter that already views these machines with a mixture of pity and awe. The battle and the capture. For a White Scars Dreadnought to fall into Ork hands, something has gone catastrophically wrong. The White Scars are masters of mobile warfare, experts at hitting hard and fast, and then withdrawing before the enemy can mount an effective counterattack. They don't fight the kind of grinding, attritional battles where expensive assets like Dreadnoughts might be overrun and captured. They're too fast for that, too tactically flexible. But even the best laid plans can go awry in the chaos of war. And the Orks have one advantage that can sometimes overcome even the White Scars' superior mobility: sheer numbers. Picture a campaign on the edge of Imperial space, a world that has been overrun by a massive Ork warg. The Greenskins have been gathering for months, drawn by the charismatic pull of a powerful war boss whose victories have made him a legend among his kind. The warg has swelled to enormous proportions, with hundreds of thousands of Orks, maybe millions, all converging on this one sector of space. The Imperium has responded as it must, deploying multiple chapters of Space Marines to stem the green tide before it can sweep across more worlds. The White Scars are perfect for this kind of warfare. They excel at hit-and-run attacks, at disrupting enemy supply lines, at assassinating war bosses, and leaving Ork hordes leaderless and confused. But the sheer scale of this warg means that even the White Scars' lightning strikes can only slow the Ork advance, not stop it entirely. Every victory seems to draw more Orks to the fight, and the warg field grows stronger with each passing day. One of the White Scars' few Dreadnoughts has been deployed to this campaign. Perhaps it was a strategic decision, recognition that the usual mobile tactics won't be enough against an Ork horde of this size, and so heavier firepower is needed. Perhaps the ancient warrior within the sarcophagus specifically requested to be awakened for this battle, driven by some old grudge against the Greenskins, or a desire to protect the chapter's homeworld from the advancing warg. The reasons don't matter as much as the result. The Dreadnought fights valiantly, as do all White Scars, even those entombed in walking tombs. Its weapons lay waste to mob after mob of Ork boys, each burst from its assault cannon, cutting down dozens of Greenskins, each swing of its power fist pulverizing Ork knobs and their crude vehicles. But the Orks keep coming. They always keep coming. That's what makes them so dangerous. Where a more intelligent species might recognize the futility of assaulting such a powerful war machine and withdraw to regroup, the Orks just see a really fun fight and charge forward with even greater enthusiasm. The turning point comes when the Dreadnought is separated from its supporting units. Maybe it advanced too far, too caught up in the thrill of battle to maintain tactical cohesion. Maybe the White Scars' own rapid strike tactics worked against them this time, with the faster bikes and land speeders pulling ahead and leaving the slower Dreadnought behind. Maybe it was bad luck, a well-placed Ork shell disabling one of the ancient war machine's legs and leaving it immobile just as a massive mob of Greenskins crashed into its position. Whatever the specific circumstances, the Dreadnought finds itself surrounded, cut off, taking fire from all directions. Its shields flare and fail under the sheer volume of incoming fire. Armor plating cracks and buckles as Ork rockets and big shooters hammer it from every angle. The ancient warrior inside fights on, because that's what Space Marines do, especially those who have already died once and been given a second chance to serve. But even the mightiest warrior has limits, and eventually, something critical gives way. Maybe it's the power plant, hit by a lucky shot from an Ork tank. Maybe it's the leg actuators, already damaged, finally failing completely. Maybe it's the weapons themselves, overheating from continuous fire and jamming at the worst possible moment. The Dreadnought topples, crashing to the ground with an earth-shaking impact. It tries to rise, servos whining, but the damage is too extensive. The war machine is disabled, immobilized, helpless. The Orks swarm over it immediately, because that's what Orks do when they see something big and impressive lying on the battlefield. They clamber over the armored chassis, bashing at it with choppers and stick bombs, trying to pry open access panels and hatches. Some of them are probably trying to steal bits of it, even as the battle rages around them, because looters are always on the lookout for good scrap. The White Scars, realizing what has happened, mount a desperate counterattack to recover their fallen brother. Bike squads race back to the Dreadnought's position, cutting through the Ork mob with roaring chainsaws and bolter fire. But they're too late. The Orks have brought up one of their crude but effective can-carrying vehicles, essentially a flatbed truck with a crane, and they're already starting to haul the disabled Dreadnought onto it. The White Scars fight, furiously, but the Ork numbers are overwhelming, and eventually they're forced to withdraw or risk being encircled and destroyed themselves. They leave behind their entombed brother, not from cowardice or callousness, but because the cold calculus of war sometimes demands such sacrifices. Better to lose one warrior, even one as precious as a Dreadnought, than to lose an entire strike force in a futile rescue attempt. The White Scars withdraw, their hearts heavy with grief and rage, already planning a return to recover or at least destroy the captured war machine. But by the time they can mount such an operation, the Dreadnought will already be in Ork hands, hauled back to the Greenskins' ramshackle base camp and delivered to the eager mech boys who have been waiting for just such a prize. The mech boys and their prize. When the captured Dreadnought arrives at the Ork base, it causes quite a stir. Dreadnoughts are impressive machines by any standard, towering over even the largest Ork knobs, bristling with weapons, armored like a tank. To the mech boys, it's a treasure trove of interesting components and technology, the kind of thing they would normally have to scavenge from dozens of smaller wrecked vehicles. And it's all in one place, ready to be taken apart and studied and repurposed. The mechs swarm around it immediately, arguing loudly in their own specialized technical jargon about what should be done with it. One big mech, probably the most influential in this particular war, finally asserts his authority by bashing a few heads together and declaring that this is his project. The other mechs grumble but accept this, because that's how Ork society works. The biggest and strongest make the decisions, and everyone else falls in line or gets stomped. The big mech circles the fallen Dreadnought, studying it with surprising care for an Ork. He's looking at the weapons, the armor plating, the joint assemblies, trying to figure out what makes this thing tick. Gretchen assistants scurry around, taking measurements with crude tools, occasionally getting stepped on by their mech master, who doesn't even notice. The mech is muttering to himself in that peculiar way that mech boys have, half technical assessment and half excited rambling about all the things he's going to do with this prize. The first step, as with all looted vehicles, is to strip away the unnecessary components. To a mech, this means anything that's too complicated, too fiddly, too un-Orky. The sophisticated targeting systems, those come out. The Imperial pattern power couplings, those get replaced with simpler Ork versions. The ornate armor plates bearing White Scars insignia, those are either torn off entirely or covered over with Orky glyphs and icons. All of this is done with typical Ork efficiency, which is to say, with heavy blows from blunt instruments and a complete disregard for the craftsmanship that went into the original machine. It's during this process that the mechs discover something that gives even them pause. the sarcophagus at the heart of the Dreadnought, and the Space Marine entombed within. The Orks know what Space Marines are, of course. They're some of the best enemies to fight, big and tough and always up for a good scrap. The Orks have looted Space Marine equipment before, power armor and bolters and the like. But they've never captured a Dreadnought with its pilot still alive inside. This is something new, something interesting. The big mech peers at the sarcophagus with fascination. He can see the life support systems, still weakly functioning despite the damage to the rest of the machine. He can see the neural interface connections, the chemical feed lines, all the delicate technology that keeps the entombed warrior alive and connected to his armored shell. To the mech, these are the most interesting bits, the gubbins that make the whole thing work. There's a debate among the gathered mechs about what to do with the Space Marine inside. Some argue that they should just rip the sarcophagus out entirely and install a proper Ork pilot, maybe a particularly mean knob who wants a bigger and tougher body. Others point out that getting an Ork to interface with this Hume technology would be difficult, requiring a lot of painful surgery and probably killing several volunteers before they got it right. And besides, one particularly clever spanner points out, if they leave the Space Marine in there, they can make him watch while they turn his precious war machine into a proper Orky killing device. This idea appeals to the Orks' sense of humor, which is cruel and simple. The thought of the Space Marine, trapped in his sarcophagus, unable to do anything but observe as his body, his sacred war machine, is desecrated and transformed, strikes them as hilarious. And so, the decision is made. The sarcophagus stays, but everything else is going to be made proper Orky. The horror of consciousness. To understand the true nightmare of this situation, we need to understand what it's like to be a Space Marine entombed in a Dreadnought. The process of interment is traumatic by necessity. The Space Marine has been so grievously wounded that his body can no longer sustain life on its own. Perhaps his lower body has been destroyed by artillery fire. Perhaps his internal organs have been pulped by a monstrous blow that would have killed a normal human instantly. Perhaps he's suffered catastrophic head trauma that has left most of his brain non-functional. Whatever the specific injury, the apothecaries of his chapter have determined that he cannot be saved in the traditional sense, but that his brain, or enough of it, remains intact, that he could be preserved within the life-supporting confines of a Dreadnought sarcophagus. The process is agonizing. The remnants of the Space Marine's body, everything that's still minimally functional, are extracted and placed into the armored sarcophagus. Life support systems are connected, feeding nutrients directly into his bloodstream, oxygenating his blood, managing his remaining biochemistry. Neural interfaces are hardwired into his brain, allowing him to control the Dreadnought's systems as though they were his own limbs. When he awakens, he is no longer entirely human, even by the post-human standards of the Adeptus Astartes. His consciousness exists in a strange, liminal space, neither fully alive nor dead, sustained by technology and sheer force of will. He can see through the Dreadnought's optical sensors, but it's not the same as seeing with eyes. He can hear through its audio pickups, but sounds are filtered and distorted. He can feel, in a sense, when the Dreadnought is struck by enemy fire, but it's a distant sensation, nothing like the pain of a wound to living flesh. Most Dreadnoughts spend the majority of their existence in a state of suspended animation, sleeping dreamlessly between battles. This is partly to preserve their failing biology, as even the best life support systems can only sustain a mortal body for so long. But it's also an act of mercy. The existence of a Dreadnought pilot is lonely and isolating. Cut off from the simple pleasures of human experience, unable to feel the sun on their skin, or taste food, or smell the air, they exist in a sensory deprivation that would drive a normal person mad within days. Space Marines are stronger than normal people, both physically and mentally, and they can endure this existence for centuries. But it's still a form of suffering, a slow erosion of identity as the years pile up, and memories of what it was like to be truly alive fade into the distance. This is why dreadnoughts are treated with such reverence in most chapters. They are heroes who have sacrificed not just their lives, but their very humanity to continue serving the Emperor. For a White Scar, all of this is amplified 1,000-fold. The loss of movement, of speed, of the physical freedom that defines their cultural identity makes the entombment particularly torturous. And now, on top of all that existing suffering, comes a new horror: consciousness during the Ork modifications. The life support systems are still functioning, which means the Space Marine is still alive, still aware. He can feel, through the Dreadnought's damage sensors, as the Orks begin to tear into his chassis. He can hear their guttural voices, their crude jokes, their excited chatter about what they're going to do with this Humy war machine. He can see, through the optical sensors that haven't been ripped out yet, as they swarm over what he has come to think of as his body. He tries to move, to fight back, but he has no power. The Dreadnought systems are offline, either from battle damage or because the Orks have deliberately shut them down. He's trapped, utterly helpless, forced to simply observe as the Greenskins violate his war machine. It's a special kind of torture, all the more horrific because it's unintentional. The Orks aren't keeping him conscious out of deliberate cruelty. They simply don't understand or care that there's a living being suffering inside the sarcophagus. He wants to scream, but he has no voice. The Vox system has been disconnected. He wants to beg them to kill him, to end this nightmare, but he can't communicate. All he can do is watch and feel as everything that made his war machine a sacred relic of the Adeptus Astartes is stripped away and replaced with Ork scrap. The psychological impact is devastating. Space Marines are trained to endure torture, to resist even the most extreme physical and mental anguish. But they're not prepared for this. There's no training regimen that covers being trapped in a walking tomb while aliens modify it. He cycles through emotions: rage at his captors, grief for his fallen state, desperation for rescue, and eventually a kind of numb horror as he realizes that rescue may never come, or may come too late. He tries to hold on to his identity, to remember who he was. He recalls his training on Chagoris, learning to ride the swift horses of the steppes before he even knew what a Space Marine was. He remembers his first kill as a scout, the fierce joy of combat. He remembers the day he was promoted to a full battle brother, receiving his Mark 7 power armor and his first combat bike. He remembers battles across a dozen worlds, the rush of wind as he led his squad in lightning raids against the enemies of the Imperium. But these memories feel distant, almost unreal. The person who experienced those things had a body, had limbs, had agency. That person died on Morak Prime, or Chagoris, or wherever his injuries were grievous enough to warrant entombment. What remains is something else, something that exists only as consciousness within a machine. And now that machine is being corrupted, transformed into something that would make the Emperor himself weep. The Orks work with surprising speed when they're interested in a project. Within hours, they've removed most of the Imperial components they consider unnecessary. The sophisticated machine spirit that helped coordinate the Dreadnought systems, that's gone, replaced with crude Ork electronics that barely function. The precision-crafted power feeds, those are torn out and replaced with cables that look like they were salvaged from a dozen different sources and hammered together. The ornate armor plating, bearing the lightning bolt insignia of the White Scars and the personal heraldry of the entombed warrior, is covered over with layers of sheet metal bolted on haphazardly. But the real transformation comes when the mechs start adding Ork weapons and systems. This is where their enthusiasm truly shines, where their innate engineering knowledge combines with their love of destruction to create something that is both terrifying and absurd. The Dreadnought's original weapons were chosen to complement White Scar's tactics. A heavy flamer for close support, perhaps, or a twin-linked Lascannon for taking out enemy armor at range. These are removed without ceremony, tossed aside to be cannibalized for parts later. In their place, the mechs weld on Ork weapons, and they don't skimp on the firepower. A massive rocket launcher goes where the Lascannon used to be. A crude tube capable of firing volleys of Ork rockets that wobble and weave through the air before impacting with surprising force. A big shooter, or maybe even a def gun, is bolted to the other arm, capable of spitting out hundreds of rounds per minute in a spray-and-pray barrage that makes up in volume what it lacks in accuracy. For close combat, they might replace a power fist with a giant buzzsaw or a massive chain chopper, weapons that lack the elegant brutality of Imperial design but more than make up for it in raw destructive capability. And they don't stop with just the arms. The mechs add more weapons wherever they can fit them. Additional shooters mounted on the shoulders, a scorcher welded to the chest, stick bombs hanging off the sides in bunches because explosives just make everything better. They install speakers, massive Vox amplifiers that blast Orky war chants and engine roars across the battlefield. They weld on scrap metal plates for additional armor, not because the Dreadnought needs it, but because more armor is always better, and besides, it gives them more surface area for Orky glyphs and icons. The paint job is inevitable. Orks believe that red vehicles go faster, and while this Dreadnought is definitely not fast by White Scar's standards anymore, they paint it red anyway, or at least partially red. Bad Moons might paint parts of it yellow to show off their wealth. Death Skulls would definitely add some blue for luck. The result is a riot of color that would make any Imperial tech priest weep. Throughout all of this, the entombed Space Marine is forced to watch and feel. He experiences every modification through the Dreadnaught's senses, like feeling someone perform surgery on your body while you're fully conscious. When they weld on new armor plates, he feels the heat. When they rip out the sophisticated targeting systems and replace them with Ork gun sights, it's like having his eyes torn out and replaced with cruder ones. When they connect the Ork weapons to his neural interface, it's a jarring, discordant sensation, like trying to control limbs that don't quite belong to him. The Orks, for their part, are having the time of their lives. This is exactly the kind of project that mechs live for, taking Humitech and making it proper Orky. They argue constantly about the best way to modify each system, occasionally coming to blows when disagreements get too heated, but they always come back to the work with renewed enthusiasm. Gretchens scurry around, fetching tools and parts, occasionally being used as impromptu measuring sticks or testing dummies for new weapons. At some point, probably near the end of the modification process, one of the mechs has a brilliant idea. They need to make sure this thing still works, right? They need to test all these new systems. And they've got a perfectly good pilot right there in the sarcophagus, someone who knows how to make a Dreadnought move. Why not make him do it? This is where the true cruelty begins. Though again, the Orks don't see it as cruelty. To them, it's just practical. They rig up some kind of control system, probably involving painful electrical shocks or crude nerve stimulation, that forces the Space Marine to respond to their commands. It's not proper control. The Space Marine maintains enough autonomy that he can't simply be puppeted like a servitor. But the Orks can hurt him if he doesn't comply, and eventually, driven by agony and despair, he does. The first time the modified Dreadnought moves under its own power, powered by Ork engines and motivated by a broken Space Marine's will, it's a moment of triumph for the mechs. They cheer and fire their weapons in the air, celebrating their success. For the Space Marine, it's the final confirmation of his nightmare. He is no longer a warrior of the White Scars. He is no longer even a proper Dreadnought. He is a tool in the hands of his enemies, and there is no escape. Comparisons to the Killer Khan. The fate of the captured White Scars. Dreadnought bears some similarity to another Ork creation, the Killer Khan. These smaller Ork walkers are also piloted by living beings, but in this case, Gretchen rather than Orks. The comparison is instructive because it shows both how the Orks approach the concept of putting a living pilot inside a walking war machine, and also how different their methods are from the Imperial Dreadnought program. Killer Khans are roughly humanoid walkers mounted on piston-powered legs, armed with heavy weapons and close combat implements. They're smaller than Dreadnoughts, more like the size of a space marine in power armor, but they're still formidable in combat. What makes them particularly noteworthy is that they're piloted by Gretchen, who have been surgically implanted into the machine in a manner not unlike how space marines are interred in dreadnoughts. The process of turning a Gretchen into a killer can pilot is crude and brutal. Mech boys and pain boys work together, which should tell you something about how messy the procedure is. The Gretchen, often chosen by lottery because there are always more volunteers than available cans, is cut open and connected to the machine systems through crude neural interfaces. Their limbs might be removed and replaced with direct connections to the can's weapons and locomotion systems. Life support is minimal, just enough to keep the Gretchen alive and functioning. The interesting thing is that Gretchen actually want to become killer can pilots. In normal Ork society, Gretchen are the absolute bottom of the hierarchy, smaller and weaker than even the smallest Ork boy. They're used as servants, pack animals, and occasionally ammunition. They're bullied, beaten, and generally treated as disposable. So the chance to pilot a killer can, to suddenly become bigger and tougher and capable of getting revenge on all those who wronged them, is incredibly appealing. The downside is that the process of becoming a killer can pilot is agonizing. The crude surgery, the forced integration with the machine, the constant pain of ill-fitting implants, all of it combines to drive many killer can pilots slightly insane. When they're first activated, they often go on murderous rampages, attacking anyone within reach, especially former tormentors. The Orks find this hilarious and consider it part of the entertainment value of having killer cans around. Once the initial bloodlust wears off, killer can pilots settle into a kind of grudging acceptance of their fate. They're still in constant pain, still driven by a mixture of battle madness and desire for revenge, but they've achieved a kind of power they never had as regular Gretchen. They fight with desperate enthusiasm, knowing that if their can is destroyed, they're likely to die with it. The modified White Scar's Dreadnought is similar in concept, but worse in every meaningful way. Like a killer can pilot, the Space Marine is trapped in a machine, forced to fight for his captors. But where Gretchen at least chose this fate voluntarily, seeking the power it offers, the Space Marine has had no choice. He was already in what he considered a living tomb, and now that tomb has been perverted beyond recognition. Unlike killer can pilots, who are at least piloting machines designed by Orks for Ork purposes, the Space Marine is trying to control a bastardized version of Imperial technology. The neural interface was designed for the sophisticated machine spirit and control systems of an Imperial Dreadnought. Now it's connected to crude Ork electronics that respond unpredictably, weapons that function through a combination of mechanical principle and wah field rather than pure engineering. It's like trying to write a letter while wearing gloves made of sandpaper. Every input delayed or distorted, every expected response slightly wrong. The psychological impact is also different. Killer can pilots might be driven mad by their transformation, but they lack the sophisticated consciousness of a Space Marine. They don't have centuries of training and discipline and loyalty. They don't carry the weight of honor and duty that defines the Adeptus Astartes. For the White Scar, every moment of this existence is a betrayal of everything he was taught to value. Every battle he fights in this corrupted form is a desecration of his oaths to the Emperor. The abomination in battle. When the Orks finally deploy their modified Dreadnought in battle, it's a sight that would make any loyal Imperial citizen's blood run cold. The once proud war machine of the Adeptus Astartes is now a mockery of its former self, covered in Ork glyphs and crude armor plating, bristling with mismatched weapons, painted in garish colors. It stomps forward with the same heavy gait as before, but now the ground shakes to the thunder of Ork war chants blasting from its speakers, rather than Gregorian hymns. The modified Dreadnought is used as a shock assault unit, which is about the only role slow walkers can fill in an Ork army. It advances alongside mobs of boys and other heavy units like Def Dreads and Killer Cans, providing heavy firepower and intimidation factor. The Orks around it, are suitably impressed by their mech's handiwork, cheering and firing their weapons in solidarity as the walking war machine lays waste to enemy positions. And it is effective, in its brutal way. The combination of Ork weapons and what remains of the Imperial chassis creates something that is surprisingly dangerous. The rocket launchers, for all their inaccuracy, can still bring down enemy vehicles with lucky hits. The big shooters and def guns put out such a volume of fire that at least some rounds are bound to hit something important. The close combat weapons, crude as they are, can still rip through armor and flesh when brought to bear. What makes it particularly effective, in a horrible, ironic twist, is the Warg field itself. The more Orks gather around this looted Dreadnought, the more their collective psychic field helps to make its ramshackle weapons and systems work. Things that should jam or misfire or simply fall apart under the stress of combat somehow hold together, at least long enough to be devastating to the enemy. It's as though the Dreadnought has been infected by Orkness, becoming more Orky the longer it spends in their company. For the entombed Space Marine, fighting is both necessary and unbearable. He has to fight, both because the Orks will punish him if he doesn't, and because some deep part of him, the part that is still a Space Marine, still a warrior of the Emperor, cannot simply give up and allow his body to be used as a passive weapon. So he controls the modified systems as best he can, directing fire at enemy positions, advancing when commanded, even engaging in close combat when necessary. But every battle is a fresh agony. He's fighting alongside the very enemies he spent his life opposing. He's using weapons that are crude mockeries of Imperial craftsmanship. He's killing under the direction of green-skin war bosses who see him as nothing more than a useful tool. And worst of all, he knows that every victory he contributes to is a victory for the Orks, furthering their war, helping them to overrun more Imperial worlds. Some part of him holds out hope for rescue. He knows the White Scars won't abandon him entirely. They'll be looking for him, or at least looking for his Dreadnought chassis. If he can just survive long enough, hold on to his sanity long enough, surely his brothers will come for him. Surely they won't leave him in this hell. But as days turn into weeks and weeks turn into months, and the war continues to rage across the sector, that hope begins to dim. He starts to understand, with a cold despair, that his brothers might not even recognize him anymore. His war machine has been so thoroughly modified that it might no longer register as a White Scars Dreadnought. And even if they do recognize it, they might assume he's dead, that the Orks have simply looted an empty chassis and installed their own pilot. The worst battles are the ones against other Imperial forces, when the looted Dreadnought faces off against Imperial Guard units, or, Emperor forbid, other Space Marines. The Space Marine inside wants to scream a warning. He wants to tell them to run, to call in orbital strikes, to do anything other than face this abomination. But he can't communicate. His Vox systems are either destroyed or broadcasting nothing but Ork war cries. All he can do is fight, and hope that his aim is poor enough that he's not directly responsible for his allies' deaths. Sometimes he tries to resist. He deliberately misses shots, or moves more slowly than commanded, or fails to press an advantage. But the Orks have ways of making him comply. Pain is a powerful motivator, even for a Space Marine, and after enough electrical shocks or chemical punishment delivered through the life support systems, he finds himself obeying despite his desire to resist. It's a special kind of defeat, being forced to betray everything you stand for through sheer physical agony. The modifications to the Dreadnought also make it unpredictable in ways that are both dangerous and tragicomic. The Ork weapons sometimes jam or explode, because that's just what Ork weapons do. The armor plating, hastily welded on, sometimes falls off during combat. The steering is inconsistent, making the Dreadnought lurch and stumble at inopportune moments. To the Orks, this is all part of the fun, further evidence that their creation is properly Orky. To the Space Marine inside, it's yet another indignity, another reminder of how far he's fallen. There are moments, brief and terrible, when the Space Marine finds himself slipping into something like acceptance. Not of his fate, never that, but of the immediate reality of combat. When he's firing at enemy positions, when he's crushing foes beneath his power claw, there's a terrible familiarity to it. This is what he was made for, what his entire existence as a dreadnought was supposed to be, bringing death to the enemies of the Imperium. It doesn't matter that he's doing it in a corrupted chassis, following Ork commands. In those moments, he's still a weapon, still serving a purpose. Then the battle ends, and he's forced to remember what he's become, and the despair returns tenfold. The White Scars response. Back among the White Scars, the loss of the Dreadnought has not been forgotten. The chapter takes its losses seriously, and the capture of one of their rare and precious dreadnoughts is a blow that goes beyond mere tactical considerations. The White Scars may have an ambivalent relationship with their walking tombs, but the warriors entombed within them are still their brothers, still deserving of honor and respect. Intelligence reports begin to filter back to the chapter, fragmentary at first, but gradually building into a clearer picture. Picked captures from battlefield recorders show glimpses of a walker matching a dreadnought's profile, but modified in ways that make it clear this is no longer purely Imperial technology. Interrogations of captured Orks, always difficult given the greenskins' limited grasp of language and tendency to boast about their victories, provide additional details. The mechs have a new toy, a Hume walker that they've made proper Orky. When the White Scars leadership realizes that their captured dreadnought is not only intact, but being actively used by the Orks, the reaction is one of cold fury. This goes beyond a simple battlefield loss. This is desecration, a violation of sacred technology, and worse, the ongoing torture of one of their brothers. The fact that they don't know for certain whether the Space Marine inside is alive or dead, whether he's being forced to fight, or whether the Orks have replaced him with one of their own, doesn't matter. The Dreadnought chassis itself is a relic, and it must be recovered or destroyed. A dedicated strike force is assembled, led by some of the chapter's most skilled warriors. Their mission is twofold: locate the looted Dreadnought and either recover it or ensure its complete destruction. There will be no half measures. If the Dreadnought cannot be saved, it must be obliterated so thoroughly that the Orks cannot salvage anything from the wreckage. The hunt for the looted war machine is not straightforward. Ork forces are constantly on the move, and a single Dreadnought in the midst of a vast is difficult to track. The White Scars use all their intelligence-gathering capabilities, deploying scout units to infiltrate Ork territory, intercepting greenskin communications, and following the trail of destruction that marks the war's passage. Gradually, they close in on their target. When they finally locate the looted Dreadnought, seeing it for themselves is a moment of profound horror for the White Scars. Through their helmet displays and targeting reticules, they see their brother's war machine transformed into something unrecognizable. The lightning bolt insignia is hidden beneath crude Ork glyphs. The elegant lines of the Imperial chassis are obscured by welded scrap metal. The weapons are Ork abominations, rather than sanctified instruments of the Emperor's will. But worse than any of the physical modifications is the knowledge that their brother might still be alive inside that corrupted shell. If he is, he's been suffering this existence for weeks or months, forced to fight for the enemy, unable to communicate or resist. For a chapter that values freedom and movement above almost all else, the thought of one of their own trapped in such a prison is unbearable. The White Scars attack with fury, born of righteous vengeance. They don't simply try to destroy the Dreadnought from a distance, they close with it, engaging it directly despite the danger. Some of them are probably hoping for some sign that their brother still lives, some indication that he recognizes them and is trying to communicate. Others are driven purely by the need to end this desecration as quickly as possible. The battle around the looted Dreadnought becomes intense and personal in a way that Ork fights rarely are. The White Scars normally prefer hit-and-run tactics, but here they're willing to commit to sustained combat, to take losses if necessary, to achieve their objective. The Orks, for their part, defend their prize vigorously. They're proud of what their mechs have created, and they're not about to let the Humies reclaim it without a fight. If the Space Marine inside is still alive and conscious, this battle must be the most agonizing yet. He can see his brothers, his chapter, the warriors he once fought alongside, and they're trying to kill him. They have to kill him, because he's become something that cannot be allowed to exist. He wants to help them, to open his armor so they can end this nightmare quickly, but he can't. The Orks are forcing him to fight back, to defend himself against his own chapter. Every shot he fires at a White Scar's bike or land speeder is a betrayal that cuts deeper than any physical wound. The most likely outcome of such an engagement is the complete destruction of the looted Dreadnought. The White Scars are among the best warriors in the galaxy, and when they focus their full attention on a single target, it doesn't tend to survive long. Melter weapons, lascannons, and power weapons converge on the corrupted war machine, tearing through its armor, destroying its weapons, rupturing its power plant. The Dreadnought falls, and this time, it doesn't get back up. In the aftermath, when the battlefield is secured and the Orks have been driven off or slaughtered, the White Scars approach the wreckage of what was once their brother's Dreadnought. They carefully cut through the destroyed chassis, searching for the sarcophagus, hoping to recover their brother's remains for proper burial rites. When they find it, if they find it intact enough to open, they might discover the truth of what he endured. The Space Marine, if he survived to this point, might have only moments of lucidity left. His life support systems are failing, his body finally giving out after the prolonged torture of Ork captivity and the violence of its end. If he can speak, if the Vox systems are working enough for him to communicate, his last words might be an apology for what he was forced to become, or a request for forgiveness, or simply gratitude that the nightmare is finally ending. The White Scars perform the funeral rites with solemn ceremony, honoring their brother's sacrifice and suffering. His name is added to the rolls of the honored dead, and his story, though tragic, becomes part of the chapter's oral traditions. They'll remember him not as the abomination the Orks made him, but as he was, a warrior of Shogoris, a son of the Khan, who endured horrors that would have broken lesser men. But the story doesn't always end with the Dreadnought's destruction. Sometimes, the White Scars arrive too late. The War has moved on, or the looted Dreadnought was deployed to a different sector, or the Orks managed to repel the White Scars' attack. In these cases, the corrupted war machine might continue to serve the Greenskins for months, or even years, a walking testament to the Orks' ability to pervert and desecrate everything they touch. Broader implications. The capture and modification of a White Scars Dreadnought by Orks has implications that extend far beyond the immediate tragedy of one warrior's fate. It serves as a reminder of several uncomfortable truths about warfare in the grim darkness of the far future. First, it demonstrates that no Imperial technology is truly safe from Ork looting and modification. The Adeptus Mechanicus likes to believe that their sacred machines are too sophisticated for Greenskins to understand or replicate. But the reality is more complex. Ork mechs, with their innate understanding of mechanics and the support of the Warg field, can and do successfully loot and modify even the most advanced Imperial technology. Dreadnoughts, Leman Russ tanks, even the occasional Titan or Imperial Knight that falls on the battlefield, all can end up in Ork hands. Second, it highlights the horrific personal cost of this kind of warfare. Wars in Warhammer 40,000 are not clean or humane. They're brutal affairs, where the losing side often suffers fates worse than death. For Space Marines, who are trained to face death with courage and accept it as the natural end of a warrior's life, the prospect of being captured and perverted like this is particularly horrifying. It's a fate that most Space Marines would choose death to avoid, if given the choice. Third, it shows the psychological resilience required of the Adeptus Astartes. The Space Marine entombed in the captured Dreadnought had to endure not just physical suffering, but also the complete destruction of his identity and purpose. He was made into a weapon for the enemy, forced to betray everything he believed in, unable to resist or escape. That he managed to maintain any sanity at all speaks to the incredible mental conditioning and sheer willpower that Space Marines possess. For the White Scars specifically, this kind of incident reinforces their existing attitudes toward dreadnoughts. They already saw entombment as a fate somewhere between honor and punishment, a necessary evil rather than a glorious transformation. The knowledge that one of their dreadnoughts was captured and desecrated by Orks only confirms their worst fears about what happens to those warriors who cannot be allowed to die cleanly on the battlefield. It might make them even more reluctant to approve future interments, preferring to let mortally wounded brothers die with dignity rather than risk them suffering such a fate. Other chapters who learn of this incident might have different reactions. More orthodox chapters like the Ultramarines or Imperial Fists would be horrified by the desecration, but would likely view it as a cautionary tale about the importance of recovering or destroying disabled war machines, rather than letting them fall into enemy hands. More brutal chapters like the Black Templars might see it as justification for their policy of never taking prisoners and never allowing the enemy to claim Imperial equipment intact. The Adeptus Mechanicus, when they hear of such incidents, add them to their extensive archives of Ork technological capabilities. Tech priests study the modifications made by the mechs, trying to understand how greenskins can make such crude changes to sophisticated Imperial systems and still have them function. Some of the more radical tech priests even admire the mech's intuitive understanding of mechanics, though they would never admit this publicly. The prevailing attitude, however, is one of disgust at the desecration of sacred technology and a renewed commitment to developing countermeasures against Ork looting. For the Orks themselves, successfully capturing and modifying a Space Marine dreadnought is a major accomplishment, one that boosts the reputation of the mechs involved and the war boss who commanded the warband that took it. Stories of the Humi Walker that got made proper Orky spread through the war, inspiring other mechs to try similar projects and encouraging the boys to target such valuable prizes in future battles. It becomes part of the folklore of that particular WOG, a tale told around campfires and scrap heaps. In the broader context of the galaxy's endless warfare, the capture of a single dreadnought, even a White Scars dreadnought, is a relatively minor incident. Billions die every day in the wars of the 41st millennium. Entire worlds are lost to Xenos invasions, Chaos incursions, and Imperial incompetence. One Space Marine, even one subjected to such a horrific fate, is statistically insignificant in the grand scheme of things. But that's the nature of tragedy in Warhammer 40,000. The setting is so vast, the scale of suffering so enormous, that individual stories of horror risk being lost in the overwhelming grimness of the universe. Yet these individual stories matter because they represent the human, or in this case post-human, cost of endless war. Behind every statistic, every casualty report, every notation in an Imperial archive, there's a person who suffered and died, or worse. The White Scars warrior entombed in the captured dreadnought is one such person. He served the Emperor faithfully for centuries, possibly millennia if he was particularly ancient. He survived wounds that would have killed lesser men, only to be locked in a walking tomb that denied him everything his culture valued. And then, in the cruelest twist of fate, he was captured by the enemy and forced to serve them, his body violated, his purpose perverted, his suffering extended indefinitely. There's a particular poignancy to this fate befalling a White Scar. For any Space Marine, the capture and desecration of their dreadnought would be a horror. But for a White Scar, who values freedom and movement above all else, who sees the entombment itself as a kind of torture, the additional violation of Ork modification might almost be redundant. He was already in hell. The Orks just made it worse. Yet even in this darkest of scenarios, there might be a glimmer of the defiance that defines the Adeptus Astartes. Even broken, even corrupted, even forced to fight for the enemy, the Space Marine inside that sarcophagus remained, in some fundamental way, a servant of the Emperor. He endured. He survived. And when the end came, whether through destruction by his brothers or the eventual failure of his life support systems, he met it as a Space Marine should, with whatever dignity and courage he had left. The Imperium of man is built on such sacrifices. Countless billions serve and die in anonymity, their names forgotten, their deeds unrecorded. The Space Marine in the captured Dreadnought is different, only in that his particular form of service and suffering is more dramatic, more viscerally horrible than most. But in the end, he's just another warrior who gave everything in a war that can never truly be won, only endured. Conclusion. The capture and modification of a White Scars Dreadnought by Orks represents one of the darker possibilities in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It combines multiple layers of tragedy, the initial horror of Dreadnought entombment, particularly for a chapter that values freedom and movement, the violation of sacred Imperial technology by Xenos hands, the psychological torture of being forced to fight for the enemy, and the eventual destruction or abandonment that ends the nightmare. For the White Scars chapter, such an incident would be both a source of shame and a rallying cry. Shame because they failed to protect one of their own and allowed him to suffer such a fate. A rallying cry because it demonstrates the depths of Ork brutality and the importance of never letting such desecration happen again. The story would be told and retold among the chapter, a cautionary tale about the importance of either recovering disabled war machines or ensuring their complete destruction. For the Orks, it's just another successful looting operation, remarkable only because the prize was particularly valuable and impressive. The mechs who performed the modifications would be celebrated, their work admired by other greenskins, and the modified Dreadnought would be used until it was destroyed or fell apart from lack of maintenance. The Orks wouldn't understand or care about the suffering they inflicted. To them, it was just good fun and a proper Orky thing to do. And for the Space Marine at the center of this nightmare, the entombed warrior who endured months or years of torture and desecration, his story would be one of almost unimaginable suffering. Already denied the warrior's death, he likely would have preferred. Already locked in a machine that represented everything his culture feared, he was subjected to additional layers of violation that would break most beings. That he endured at all is a testament to the resilience of the Adeptus Astartes and the strength of spirit that can exist even in the darkest circumstances. In the end, the fate of a White Scars Dreadnought captured by Orks is a perfect microcosm of the Warhammer 40,000 setting itself. Grim, dark, filled with suffering and horror, yet somehow still containing glimmers of heroism and defiance. The Imperium of man survives not because its victories are glorious or its methods humane, but because men and women and post-human warriors like this Space Marine continue to serve and suffer and endure, even when hope itself seems like a distant memory. The galaxy is a vast and terrible place, filled with horrors beyond counting. But it's the individual stories, the personal tragedies, the moments of suffering and sacrifice that make that vastness real and give it meaning. The White Scars warrior in his corrupted Dreadnought is just one story among billions, but it's stories like his that remind us why the setting resonates so deeply. Because even in the darkest darkness, even in the most hopeless situations, the human spirit, or post-human spirit, continues to fight on. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the darker corners of Warhammer 40,000 lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. We explore all aspects of the grim darkness of the far future, from the grand sweep of galactic events to the individual stories of suffering and heroism that make the setting so compelling. Ring the notification bell to be notified when we post new content, and let us know in the comments what aspects of Warhammer 40,000 lore you'd like us to cover next. For the Emperor and the Khan, and for all those who serve in darkness, that others may live in light.